All right, we've got a few more people joining. So what we're going to do is we are going to get started. So for today's presentation, we're going to be doing an integrations workshop, which is really a hands-on or a jump start with Snyk. So both Jairo and I, and actually let's do a quick little round of introductions. My name is Shawn Miller. I'm the Senior Community Engineering Manager, and I have here with me.
Hey everyone, my name is Jairo and I am a technical success manager here at Snyk. Super excited to be on today's office hours.
So for today's presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to make a practical walkthrough of Snyk, and we're going to go through a couple of the key integrations and how you would go through results, as well as basically do issue management. So how do you look at an issue? How do you ignore an issue? How do you create a potential fix for an issue? As well as how do you create the Jira connection and log a Jira ticket as well directly from Snyk interface. Now, we only have a very few slides. I believe it's 2 or 3 actual slides that we'll be showing in the presentation. The vast majority will be in product, but we do have 1 or 2 up front that we just want to use to set the table. We do have a Q&A allotted towards the end. So the content, we've been practicing roughly about 45 minutes for the content itself. And then we have till the top of the hour for Q&A, and definitely feel free to ask questions in the chat. Jairo and the team are going to be responding in chat. But if there's really good questions with the content that we're covering at that time, the team's free to raise it and we'll cover it at that time, or we can cover it at the Q&A at the end. So thanks for that. Now, just before we get into the content itself, one of the things that we wanted to do is show you how to find resources. And we typically have this resource slide right at the beginning, just because we know people will jump off during the Q&A. But the cool thing is Snyk actually added a very cool feature about a month or 2 ago that helps highlight a lot of the resources that you as a customer have access to Snyk. And this is available to all customers, whether you're on a free or a paid plan. So on the bottom left, what you're going to notice is there's a help icon. And the very first option is something called a user hub. So we really push to have this feature created because it highlights a lot of the resources that you have available to help out. So you have not only your docs, you have the API reference if you want to use the API if you're on business or enterprise. You have things like technical services. So our technical service teams build a lot of utilities or scripts that you can use, often for things like onboarding and just tools that help you with certain integrations with Jira and other things. And then you have some other things that really help out that go towards the larger big picture of helping make you more secure. Like, for example, when you're designing an application, you might want to decide which packages you want to use or which base image you want to use. Well, we have a site called Snyk Advisor that helps you select packages, or Snyk Learn, which helps with secure coding. And then, of course, we have various other pages for events and customer success and so on. But I'm going to be a little bit selfish here, and I'm going to plug the community that we have at Snyk. Down at the very bottom, there's a Snyk on Discord link that you can click. I'm actually one of the moderators on our Snyk community. We have 2 communities that you can access. We have the DevSecOps, which is a bunch of practitioners talking about related security topics, or we have the product community, where if you have questions about how to use Snyk or how certain features work and so on, we encourage you to ask questions, but also share information with other customers as well, if you're comfortable sharing information. So that's all accessible from the user hub, which again is on the bottom left of the Snyk UI. And so we just want to make sure you're aware of where to find resources. Now, before we get into the content, we did want to do a quick poll, and this will give everybody a chance to see, what your peers are potentially looking at doing as well. And so we had a quick question that we wanted to launch. So hopefully on your screen, you are able to see the poll. And the poll question is, where do you see yourself inserting security testing? Do you want to do it as part of your Git repository? So when you check in code, you potentially see issues. Do you want to integrate it in the CI/CD? So as you do builds, you get results. You might have build artifacts. Do you want to integrate it on the IDE? So as a developer is working, they can check the code. Is it something that your security team, maybe you have somebody who's doing audits, is using? Or maybe you might be using a combination of all of them. Feel free to choose that. So we'll give everybody maybe another 10 seconds and I'll close the poll, and then we'll share the results for everybody. Awesome. All right, so let's end the poll and let me launch that. So just for the benefit of everybody on the video who might not be seeing this later, what we see here is that it's a pretty even split between Git repository and the developer IDE, with CI/CD trailing behind that. So 67-33 split. So that's pretty common what we've been seeing, especially with Git repository. It's good to see that the IDE is getting some interest with everybody today. So, all right, let's stop the poll. So we have quite a bit of content that we're going to be covering. And we're going to go through the actual integrations in the UI itself. It's not PowerPoint or presentation driven, but we did have one or two very quick slides that we wanted to highlight. And one of the things that we want to make to help with, I guess, is when we talk about security scanning, a lot of times when you first start, it's all about trying to understand what is the big problem and where are issues, how do we fix them? And one of the things that makes Snyk very unique is that when we talk about our tool, it's not just having a security scanner, it's about helping you build secure applications. And so what you're going to find is how you initially use it in the first couple of days is going to be very different from the long-term strategy of how you would want to use Snyk. And Jairo, you work with a lot of our customers. Can you maybe talk to how you see customers implementing it in, say, the first 30 days versus what's the steady state people generally drive through? What integrations do they start with and where do they end up? Do you mind covering some of that?
Sure, Shawn. The first thing that customers will approach this is just kind of think through what is their end goal first, right? Is it to meet an audit, meaning that they only have 30 days to scan all their repos through their Git? Is it to actually shift left and start encouraging developers to fix vulnerabilities earlier on in the SDLC? Or is it just to get an understanding of what their vulnerabilities are, right? What their current vulnerabilities are. So the easiest way to actually integrate into Snyk, or one of the easiest ways to integrate into Snyk, is through the Git. So we do see a majority of our customers start there just to get an understanding of what their risk is, right? And then based off of that, they then strategize to say, hey, does it make sense to integrate into the build pipeline? And maybe that's where we want to fail the build and not necessarily fail in the Git. And we'll get into how to set all that up in the next couple of minutes here. But then also the build excuse me, not the build pipeline, but the developer's environment. So that would be like the IDE or the CLI. They will, after they imported all the repos and they have everything scanning, they'll introduce the IDE plugin or the CLI to their developers to make them aware of, hey, we are starting to monitor repos, etc. And we want to introduce you to the Snyk IDE plugin that's going to allow you to scan locally and fix any vulnerabilities that could potentially fail either your PR or your builds later on.
It's important to state, like, again, we have different integrations and it's not uncommon to have multiple of those integrations configured because, again, each one solves a different problem, right? The IDE is all about helping you build it right the first time and being able to validate as you are building. So imagine you pick a package, you check it, and then you write all your code around that. It means that you're not finding the issue later on and having to recode all the code around that. Or if you're doing, say, like you're writing first-party code, you run a test really quickly, you're not going to reintroduce that issue through all the other forms that you're building, as an example. And the idea here is that each of the integrations will solve a different use case. And we also have things that go beyond, again, just scanning. We have Snyk Advisor, which is all about helping you pick the packages even before you write code or a base image for your container. We have things like Snyk Learn that's all around secure coding. And these are all included, whether you're on the free plan or you're a current customer, you have access to these resources through the user hub, like what I was showing earlier. So what we're going to do is we are going to go through each of these integrations to show you how to set it up and how you would use it. Jairo is going to talk a lot about the different use cases we typically see customers use. We aren't really diving too deep in this presentation on that, but it's also important to note that we also have integrations with things like Kubernetes, which you have on the business or enterprise plan, integrations into registry, which all customers have access, and so on. And the idea there is that your security team might also want a separate view of what's currently in production or what's being shared in your registry and so on. And the idea there is you may want to have two separate views. And again, you can achieve that through Snyk. So the first integration that we're going to start on is the Git repository. So setting up the Git repository is really quick, but if you're a brand new customer who's just signed up, there are a couple of key initial settings that you'll want to do. And I'm sure many of you may have sat on Nora's implementation session where she walks customers through all the initial settings. This is it's a little bit repetitive in some cases, or an extension of some of the things that you might see. And so the key thing here is, in my environment that you're seeing on the screen right now, basically there are a couple settings you might want to review just to make sure you have it set up before you start importing your project. So the first thing is, you would go in, you'd make sure what are the different organizations, or how are you aggregating your projects by development team, by the type of application, and so on. So right now I'm working in my mobile apps directory, or what we call an organization. The next thing that you'll do is you'll go to settings, and you want to make sure that you have the relevant settings for the types of products that you're using with Snyk. So if you've purchased Snyk code, you'll want to go over to the Snyk code menu and you'll want to enable it. If you've used the wizard, there is actually an option where it says, hey, do you want to allow Snyk to scan your source code? And this will be automatically turned on if you use that initial wizard when you first start importing. So in my case, I am going to turn it on. If you have infrastructure as code, that's likely to already be on, but it is worth double checking that. And again, you can configure your rules and change some of the default settings that are set up there. And then last but not least, if you're on a plan that has license management on it, you would have the options here to go in and configure that. However, I'm in a free plan right now, so I don't have those options. So the next thing that you're going to do is you are going to basically start importing your projects. So what you're going to do is go over to the project screen, and you can start adding projects. But there are some additional settings that we can set up in the integration. So let's take a look at how you could go and configure those integrations. So there is an integrations menu up here, where you can click integrations on the main menu. Either one works. And you'll see here that we have access to all our Git repositories. Now, if you're using something like Azure or Bitbucket or GitLab, what you'll do is you'll provide a username and you'll provide a credential or a token from that environment that will allow Snyk to connect to it. And each of the setup screens for those integrations will tell you what permissions you need to set up in those environments. If you go to add projects and you don't see any permissions, it's probably your token doesn't have the right permissions. If you choose GitHub, what's going to end up happening is you'll get a screen from GitHub. It'll ask you to authorize, and you simply click OK, and the connection is made. But if you have multiple organizations in your GitHub, it's really important that you have admin privileges or the ability to create webhooks in that organization. Otherwise, Snyk can't access it. So you may need to ask an admin to do that for you. They might even have to go into GitHub under OAuth or under the third-party settings and click a button that says grant in order to give access to those organizations. So usually if you don't see any projects in Snyk, it's because your token doesn't have the right rights, or you don't have the ability to add Snyk to your different orgs. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that, because it is a common use case if there's an issue. So under settings, the last little bit here, just before I move on, is in your settings for your code repository, there you have a couple of different options, and probably the most important ones to check just to start is to make sure that you have access to your private and public repos. You're welcome to change that if you want, but for this use case, we'll use public and private repos. And then you have this option that you can set in Snyk to have Snyk analyze your pull request. So every time a developer writes code, Snyk will go in and check that pull request and see if there are any new vulnerabilities introduced, and we'll show you that as a check, which will be a pass or fail as part of your pull request. So again, just using GitHub as an example here, this is a pull request where I made a modification. I basically modified a login page, and you can see that there's an issue with my first party code. I can click details to go into that, and it actually looked at my license and open source issues, and it didn't find any new issues introduced. And so this check is something that you can turn on or off, because what else Snyk also does is we also check every 24 hours. So even when you're not working on it, we will check your repository for any new issues. Now, one of the really important things is if you are importing dozens or hundreds of projects, if you have a lot of developers, you may actually want to turn this off to start. So the idea being that you may not want to, in some environments where you really lock it down, and if there's a failed check, you don't allow that code to progress, you might end up blocking on dozens or hundreds of projects, and that can end up being a huge source of frustration to start. So what we often suggested is, if you do have a lot of projects, turn it off here, and then you can go into the settings for the individual projects and turn it on for a couple key projects to start. And that's usually where, if you have a really large portfolio, where people start. If you have a much smaller portfolio, you're a startup, early stage company with only a few dozen projects, then it's fine to leave that on. There's no technical reason for turning on and off. It's really more of a, just imagine you have 100 developers where suddenly you have all these failing checks on all your projects. That may be a huge issue to start. So by turning it on to a couple key projects to start, that helps with buy-in and adoption. Jairo, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I did want to add one last thing though. If you already imported projects and you said, oh, we did purchase code, or you want to test out code, and you went ahead and turned it on, you will have to re-import your repos. That way that will sync and we'll be able to pull the analysis for the code there.
No, very good point. Now, the last thing, just before I leave the screen, one of the other things that you may want to consider is when Snyk is failing that check in the pull request. It's quite common where you want to focus, especially at the beginning, on high and critical issues or things that the developers can actually fix. And so you'll see that you have additional options here where you could say only fail the check if it's high and critical, or if the issue is fixable. And the idea being there that it may be caught later in the pipeline if you wanted to have that check, and if you disabled it here, or if you limited it to just high and critical, it may pass here and then fail later on in the pipeline, and that'll give you the ability to check in the code and deal with it later as part of your development process. So the idea here is it's all about flexibility, what works for your team. And the most common practices, again, as I said, is to turn this off for large number of projects, or turn it on for a couple key ones to start, and then let's say after 30 days, then turn it on for the rest of your projects. And that's where you may want to turn on a couple of these controls, where maybe only do it on the high and critical to start. So you focus on the really important things to start. And with all of our testing, you'll see that that's a common theme where you can add filters or options to help focus. But that seems to be the most common settings that you will typically use.
Now, once you're ready to turn this on, something you might want to do, or something you should consider, is communicating this to your developers, right? So that they're not caught off guard. And you could do this in multiple ways. Obviously, you could do an email, you could create an internal page where you have an introduction of what Snyk is and what the user experience is going to be, etc. But also you can do a training, or point them to office hours where we can do a training with them, and essentially introduce the IDE to let them know, hey, you could use this to help fix issues, but hey, we're going to start failing some things. So you might see something like what Shawn's showing now, and this way they're not caught off guard, and you're giving clear expectations of what they need to do. So for example, if something is failing, what does the developer need to do? Do they need to enter a specific Jira or follow a specific workflow that you have in place, or do they have an SLA they need to meet? This is all information that you want to make sure you've documented somewhere and you've trained your developers on.
Yeah, and whenever one of the things we talk a lot about is layering in control. So the first couple of days you might not have PR checks on, or if you do, you have that path set up where if a check happens like this, and let's say in your environment you're using protected branches, and if a check fails, you're not going to allow it to progress in your code. Well, what if something mission critical happens where you need to provide an exception to let it go forward? It's important to communicate to the developers, if you have that scenario, how do you override this check? And in the Snyk's case, what that means is if you have an admin in Snyk, they have the ability to go in and do this setting called market successful in SCM. So this is effectively an override that a Snyk admin can click, and that'll change the status of that check, and it'll clearly indicate that it's been overridden. And that's what I'm trying to cover here essentially, is that you want to make sure that the exception or escalation path is known by your developers. Snyk already does this, but make sure your developers are aware of it. And similarly, if you fail a build based on Snyk, make sure they're aware of, okay, if a build fails and it's something mission critical that needs to go forward, and then an exception is going to be approved by the business, how do you actually enable that? Is that somebody on the build team that can allow it to pass? Are they using a test where Snyk isn't running and allow it to go forward? what is that path forward? And so communicating that, again, it's not just having a tool, it's about having that established process. So you have that seamless thing, set of processes set up, and that you reduce those friction points. So, okay, so basically what we've done here is we've turned on Snyk code. As Jairo mentioned, if you already imported, you just need to re-import your projects if you forgot to do this earlier. And then the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to import your projects. So if you have never imported projects before, you'll probably get a screen like this. It's just showing you projects that we thought are important, but in most cases, you'll probably click show all repositories. And this will show you, in my case, I have multiple organizations that I have access to, and I can expand these and import those projects. This is what I was mentioning before, where if you don't see your orgs or your projects, it's probably permission related, and you'll need to investigate that. But it's generally like 9 times out of 10, pretty straightforward. I'm just trying to make sure you're aware of that 1% where issues happen. But when you want to start onboarding your projects, it's pretty easy. You pick your projects. So in my case, I have a number of projects here. I'm going to click add selected projects, and Snyk's going to start, basically connect to the repository and start onboarding it. So it'll set up that 24-hour schedule. It'll set up the pull request check. So anybody who creates a pull request check, or sorry, pull request against that repository will see those checks that we saw earlier. And right now it's doing all, in my case, 4 different types of analysis. It's looking at the open source, the infrastructure as code, it's looking at the Docker file, and it's also looking at first party code as well. And you can see here the things as it's scanning, what it's actually completed. So my Goof project, it's already finished the first party code. It's found a number of deployment files. So that's your infrastructure as code, and my open source. Now, I'm going to go through and show you how to review these results later, because again, regardless of which integration we use, reviewing it's a very similar process. But to give you a quick little preview, I can just click this, and you'll see that it shows the results pretty quickly. It tells me a lot of information about how it was introduced, what was fixed, and then we can start actioning on these things like ignoring it, fixing it, or logging it to Jira, and so on. Again, we're going to cover this a little bit later in the presentation, but that's effectively how you can set up your GitHub integration.
Now, if you have thousands of repos that you need to import, there is a Snyk API import tool, which I'll actually put the link to it now in the chat. But that is something that you could leverage to expedite this, right? So like some use cases would be where someone needs to scan all their repos for an audit or something. They will use that to just kind of get everything in here and then delete anything that they need to later. But other than that, that's a really great tool that I would recommend using.
Awesome. So the next thing we're going to cover is the IDE. So again, when you set it up in GitHub, it's great. You start scanning, you get your results right away. You know where the issues are. You can start tasking your developers with fixing the big issues. When you start moving into developer first, that's really about enabling the developer. Give them tools that as they are working on it, they can start testing right away. And the idea is that you're no longer being reactionary, finding these issues, forcing them to go back, fix things after they're done. It's something they can check very quickly and easily while they're working on it. And so when you're using an IDE, so we support many IDEs like Visual Studio, VS Code, Eclipse, IntelliJ, PyCharm, many different IDEs. All the IDEs have open source to scan with, Snyk code, and we've been adding in other capabilities like infrastructure as code and container to a lot of the IDEs as well. And so definitely, if you're using one of our IDE integrations, remember to upgrade regularly so you can see the new features and functions. I'm using IntelliJ because it does have all 4 products in it, but you'll see that the methodologies, the different ways you use it are very similar in VS Code and Eclipse and the different IDEs. So the first thing is when you want to install the IDE, it's pretty straightforward. You go to the marketplace for that IDE, you search for Snyk, and you'll typically find something like this, where you'll find like Snyk security, in this case, code, open source, and so on. And there's lots of useful resource links and information there. The next thing that you'll do is you'll then configure that plugin in the IDE. And the configuration is pretty straightforward. Once it's installed, you need to authorize Snyk. And we make it easy by, you'd click this button called Connect IDE to Snyk. It'll open a browser. You'll authenticate to Snyk, and then it completes the handshake. So then the ID is now authorized under your user profile. Now, the problem is sometimes you're in a locked-in environment where that browser is not available or won't open. So how do you use the ID? Well, you can provide it a token, which you can find under your profile in Snyk. So there's two types of tokens in Snyk. You have service accounts, which are available in the higher plans, but you also have a personal token, which is used for a number of different things. So in my case, you'll notice I click my name, I click account settings, and then you'll see here that the auth token is here. So this auth token is used for API, CLI, and a number of different things. And so all you would do is you just provide that token right here in this box. Now, the other thing is you may want to point it to your organization in Snyk, and we'll talk about orgs in a few moments. But the idea is it would pull down the rules from that specific org. And then at this point, I can click OK, and I'm ready to start scanning. And what you'll see is that if I can get this Mac window out of the way, you'll see here that there's a Snyk tab in your IDE, and you'd effectively click the play button. If I were to click this now, it would take about 2 minutes to run the full scan for Snyk code. And all the other scans will typically run within about 30 seconds. So open source, IAC, lightning quick, and my container scan will probably take about 2 minutes. So the idea here is that when you run that scan, what you'll see is you do get those results really quickly. It'll give you information about how the vulnerability was introduced and also what's required in order to fix that specific issue, and any relevant information is all available on this tab. And of course, it'll do the highlighting and the UI. And so this is really valuable because imagine you add a package and you get insights like this telling you, hey, these are the issues with this particular package. Maybe we should upgrade it, or maybe we should go to Snyk Advisor and maybe pick an alternate package. Those are the types of lookups we can do. Similarly, if I'm looking at something like Snyk code, where maybe I'm looking for to predict what vulnerabilities are on different pages, you'll see here that it gives the code traces, and then it gives some examples of how you might address that particular issue. And the idea here, again, is we give you information for each type of scan in the IDE. If you have infrastructure as code, so those are things like Terraform files or Kubernetes deployment files, you'll have all the information there telling you what is the missing line of code that you have, or maybe you need to change a particular value. What do you need to change in those infrastructure as code files? And then last but not least, we also have containers. So the one caveat that I'll mention around containers is that you do need to build your container and tag it prior to scanning it with Snyk, because what we're going to do is we're going to look at your deployment files, determine what container it is, pull it, and test it. So it's very important that if you want the container scan to run within the IDE, that you've already built and tagged it. And we're going to be building some technologies to help us long-term, but since those are features, I don't want to talk about that. But the idea here is that you can get those results not only about the individual packages and the issues that were found there, but we also give image information around what base image you're using, and are there base images that are much better than what you're currently using. So, definitely we go through all the different layers and give high-level strategies like this, but then we go down to the package level issues as well. So that's all I wanted to cover for IDE. Just taking a look at time, I want to quickly move on to CLI. But the IDE is something very powerful because it allows you to test it locally on your machine and get those results. After a few lines of code, you can validate it, as opposed to you finish it only to find out you got to go back and make a whole bunch of changes. So that's the value of the IDE. Now, Jairo is going to drop a couple links in the chat, but basically the CLI that we're taking a look at right now is a very useful tool because you can use it locally, or you can tie it into CI/CD. In fact, a lot of our integrations, a lot of our built-in pipes and things like Bitbucket and so on, Jenkins, they all use the CLI under the hood. So the CLI is an incredibly powerful tool. It's very lightweight, and to install it is really easy. You essentially run a command called npm install -g Snyk, and that'll install Snyk on your machine. But what do you do if you're on a build system that's really locked down? Well, there's a binary that you can pull down from Snyk that has everything that Snyk needs to run. Or we have curated images, which you can pull that has the Snyk CLI in it. Or you know, if you're on your local machine and you want to pull it down via Homebrew, we can do that as well. So the link that Jairo's put in the chat has all the different ways you can pull Snyk, but this is the most common way, just running a quick npm command. And just like the IDE, in order to use the CLI, you need to authorize it. Well, how do you do that? It's a simple command called SnykAuth. When you do that, it'll open a browser, you'll authenticate to Snyk, and then you'll be able to use it. But again, what do you do if you don't have, if the browser won't open or that handshake can't happen? Well, what's really cool, again, remember under your user profile, you have that auth token that you can use. And that's really useful on your local machine. But if you're on a build system, remember, if you're on a build system, and I can show you this in another environment where I have a service accounts. We have these service accounts for business and enterprise customers, and this will allow you to create a token. This is much more likely to be used in CI/CD integration. So on your local, you use your personal tokens as part of an integration. You would typically use service accounts in the bigger plans. All right, so let me go back to my ungrouped. Let's go back to the environment we were in a moment ago. All right, cool. So basically for the CLI, once you've authorized it, and actually, sorry, there was one other way we can authorize too. You can also use an environment variable called Snyk token. So you basically, if let's say I was writing a pipe or something like that, I can create an environment variable called Snyk token and set it to like my service account token. And when the CLI starts up, it looks for that environment variable. If it finds it, then it authorizes automatically. So in the build integration scenario, you don't need to use the SnykAuth command. You can just have an environment variable that you pull from your secure token store if you want to. So that's another way you can use it. But to actually start running tests, this is where we get into the cool level of detail where for each product that Snyk has, like open source, code, IAC container, there's a slightly different command that you'll run to run the type of analysis. So if you're scanning open source, the command is simply Snyk test. And there are options we can provide. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But the idea is right now, this project has a package JSON. It's going to go and test that package JSON or POM XML or projects, whichever language you have. There's different ways that the open source are specified. But the idea is it'll go through that. It'll tell you which packages you need to update and which version, and it'll tell you what issues will be addressed. And again, all of our output is geared around helping you fix it. And that's what this information is showing here. If you're in a mono repo, you can actually run a command called all projects. And this will pick up your, let's say you had a Java project with a JavaScript front end, it would find the POM XML and the package JSON and so on. So definitely look up these features and look up how you would use them. But all projects is a good way to address if you have multiple manifests for open source. For Snyk code, it's a little bit different. You're going to provide the product name. You'll go Snyk code test. And this will run the analysis on the CLI. And again, this will give you the results. Again, it'll take about a minute or two to run these results right now. But effectively, it's going through, tracing through all of the code, trying to identify things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and so on. And you'll see here that it's gone and completed. And it'll tell you, this is the file, this is the line that it occurred on, and this is why this is important. Snyk code integrated in the CLI is very useful for CI/CD use cases, but this output is really geared more towards automation. It's not really geared around fixing. So when your developers go to fix it, they're going to do it as part of the IDE workflow or part of the Git workflow where we show the full code traces. You can also pair up the CLI with a plugin we have called SnyktoHTML. And that'll give you a nice formatted report as opposed to something like this. Because Snyk code, because we show all the code traces, your CLI output would just be too large and unmanageable. So that's why we have a plugin called SnyktoHTML, which formats all the outputs from all our different products. And you would want to pair that with the CLI if you did want to get the nice formatted output in your CI/CD. Now, IAC is a little bit different. IAC, again, we can scan things like Terraform files, CloudFormation templates, Kubernetes deployment files, things like that. And again, the idea here is you run Snyk IAC test. And the cool thing is with IAC, we're actually going to scan all three of those deployment files, or sorry, the 2 deployment files that you see there. And effectively, we're going to compare it against the rule set that Snyk has, looking for security issues, telling you what it is, how to fix it, and where it occurred. So again, really quick output, gives you all the information you need to fix it, which is awesome, both locally and as part of the CI/CD use case. Last but not least, we also have container scanning. And so to scan your container, what you're going to do is run Snyk container test. You'll give it the name and tag of the container you're trying to scan. So in my case, I have a container called Shawn Snyk Docker Goof. And then you would say, for example, say latest or whichever tag that you're scanning. And this would go and scan it. So again, in my case for time, I'm not going to run it, but it'll take about a minute and a half to run this full scan. And the idea here is it'll give you all the information across all your different layers, telling you how it was introduced, what it was fixed in. And you'll also see information like, for example, with a single change, by changing the base image, we could potentially fix hundreds of issues. So go from 437 issues all the way down to 44 with a single change. But we give different flavors because some images may be better than others or easier to migrate to. We try to give the developer the information and able to fix it. And there's lots of options that really help you from a productivity standpoint. So for example, I could say things like exclude base image vulns or things like that. So there's lots of options where as a developer, maybe I'm not responsible for the base image, or maybe it's owned by somebody else. So I can't do anything about it myself. Somebody else will deal with it. So just show me the issues that were in the layer that I created or that I have in my Docker file. And so by excluding those base image vulns, I can now focus on those issues. Similarly, we also have parameters that you can look at the app vulns versus the Linux package vulns. In fact, as of January, we're going to be showing both. But that's how you can use the CLI to test locally on your machine. But you can also push results to Snyk, so you can see it within the Snyk UI. And instead of using Snyk test, you're going to use Snyk monitor. And this is the really important thing. You're going to want to tell Snyk where to push the results to. And this is done by providing the org flag saying, which folder or which org in Snyk do you want to push it to? And you can find it either in the URL. So when you're on the projects page, you can see like the short version up here, which I'm going to steal right now. Or you can find it under settings and you can see the long ID here. Either one is usable. But the idea is when you run that scan, you're going to push it to the org by doing --org. You can also use the --org in your test command. And that means that we'll pull the settings, ignores, things like that. During the test, not just the monitor. So you may also want to provide it in the test command, not just the monitor command. And that's pushing the results up to Snyk. It gives you the URL telling you where it was pushed. You can do the exact same thing for like IAC or containers. So again, you would go --org. Actually, sorry. Let me come back to IAC in a second. But the idea here is when you do a Snyk monitor, you would do the same thing for the container. You go Snyk monitor. And then you would provide that command org equals. So again, we're telling it, push the results to Snyk. Here's the name of the container. Here's the folder to push it to. And you would run that. Now, when you run those results in for IAC, it's a little bit different. So open source and container are looking at packages where new vulnerabilities are being disclosed all the time. That's why you have to monitor it. Even when you're not working on it, we're checking it to let you know vulnerabilities. Code in IAC is a little bit different because, especially in the case of IAC, we're checking it against a set of rules that you've specified. So it doesn't need to be constantly rechecked. And so when you run a Snyk test, you're just going to add an extra option called --report. And so this will basically when it runs the test, it'll automatically push the set of results to the Snyk UI. But again, you'll want to push the org ID there saying which folder it goes to. So that's how you would basically push results to Snyk. In the container and open source, you run monitor. In IAC, you add that flag saying do reporting while we're doing testing. And then for Snyk code, currently you can do a build artifact as part of your build process using that SnyktoHTML plugin. We are looking at adding reporting, the ability to push reporting later this quarter. So you should be seeing something fairly soon for that. But the end result is when you push those results to Snyk, if we were to go over to our projects page here, over on the left-hand side, you'll notice that we have filters. Because remember, this was empty when we started. I've imported stuff from GitHub, and I've also imported stuff from our CLI. Let's go focus on the CLI results. And you can see just in the couple seconds while I was showing you stuff, we have some deployment information, file information, as well as our open source. And we can go and click on those and go through the results. And we can start actioning on them. So getting all the information about what the issue is, how it occurred, and so on. You can see, regardless if I'm looking at the open source through the CLI, or if I do it through GitHub, you get essentially the same UI. So let's go take a look at this one. So you'll see here again, it's very similar UI. So basically from here, when you want to review issues, there's typically two ways you'll do it. If and this is why Jairo mentioned at the beginning, like it's all about what your end goals are. If you are interested in a specific project, you'll probably come to the project screen to do this. However, if this is day one and you've just onboarded 50 apps, you're actually going to do it from the reporting screen, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But the idea is when you're reviewing issues, what you can do on the screen is you'll see all the information. It tells you what dependencies you have, where they came in. That's all under the dependencies tab over here. You'll see that there's like, you can even get the tree representation, all of that. But the idea here is what do you do if you found like 1,000 issues for your one project that you care about right now? In my case, I have 95, but we'll use this as an exaggerated example. Well, over on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's a number of different ways you can filter it. Like maybe you want to focus on things that only have a mature and proof of concept exploit. Maybe you want to focus on high and critical to start. We've now taken that from 95 issues, which my 3 developers probably couldn't get through in a couple of days, to 26, which they probably could get through in a couple of days with that small team. The idea here is it gives us a place to start. It gives us a way that we can get to some highly valid results very quickly, and high impact, I should say. But what if you don't know what criteria you want to use? Well, this is why Snyk introduced something called a priority score. And the idea here is this score takes all the metadata that we have around the vulnerability. So it's not just high, medium, and low. It's, is there a known exploit for this vulnerability? Is it the brand new shiny thing that's trending on Twitter that everybody's talking about? You know, does it have a fix? So it's something you could do something actually about. And so each of these vulnerabilities is scored, and you can actually use the priority score over here. And what we found is most customers start with 700 as the magic number to start. And again, the idea here is if you have 10,000 issues, what are the issues that you start on? Which are the worst of the worst? And this gives you something manageable that you can start on. And we're not saying only fix those 8 issues, but it gives you that place to start that you can start actioning on and show value quickly. Now, this is all fine when it's a single project that you care about, but what if you have a much larger project? So I'm going to go to a different environment with a lot more projects. And this is where, actually, before I do that, let me go back to that environment. Sorry, I had one more thing I was going to show you. So we have this reporting facility, which you would have access to. Sorry, I'm butterfingers today. So you have this reporting facility that will give you access to all of the reports across all of your projects in your org, or at the group level across all of your orgs. So like a massive roll-up report. And what this screen allows you to do is we have the different trending, the different stats on the first tab. But imagine, let's talk through a couple of real use cases. What happens if tomorrow Log4j came out as a vulnerability that everybody's talking about? Or what if you had a dependency that was in the news and you're really, really concerned about, do you have that specific CVE or dependency? And this is where the issues and dependencies tabs become very useful. I can go here and I can look for a specific CVE, or I can go to the dependencies tab and I can look for that specific dependency to see not only am I using that dependency, but where is it actually being used for whichever scenario. Like, for example, here we have the Log4j one, and it'll tell me, oh, it's currently being used in 2 projects, and I can click through and examine and so on and so on. And so these tabs are very useful to help filter and go through those different use cases to help you find those things. But similarly, what do you do if you have 10,000 issues, or in my case, I have over 3,000 issues? I have a small team. We are not going to get that fixed by the end of the week. Where do we start? Where can we start showing value? And so this is where those filters become very useful in this screen, where, I'm going to fix them, but maybe to start, I'm going to have another team deal with the configuration or IAC. Let's just focus on the vulnerabilities in our open source and our first party code. Maybe I want to focus on things that have a known exploit. Maybe I want to focus on things that have an actual fix. And what we can see here is we can take that issues of 3,000 issues down to 121. Guess what? That's something startable. I can start there. Or we can use that slider that I was mentioning before, and that gives us a clear place we can start those issues. Now, this is how you can use the reporting today. We do have some reportings. Many of you are actually already on the beta, and we are going to be releasing this in Q1 of next year, I believe in the earlier part, but just to show you what that looks like. I did have another environment where I was going to show you this, and that's why I was flicking back and forth. I had 3 environments to show you different things: the empty, the existing example that I just showed you, and then this is the future. So we advertised this on or announced it at our launch at the beginning of November. And the idea here is you'll see that there's now 2 tabs. You have your reports tab and your dependencies tab. Your reports tab allows you to do exactly what I showed you earlier. However, this screen is fundamentally more performant than the older UI. Our team has done an amazing job optimizing the new capabilities, but also just from a filter perspective here, you can see there's a lot more filtering capabilities. We can still do the same things we did before, but you'll see that we now can chain in many different criteria to help filter. You can indicate where you're pulling those results from and so on. So very, very useful utility. Same with dependencies. You can do the same thing that you saw me earlier, where we search for the dependency and see where they are and so on. Now, this is all fine in the tool, but what if you need to get that data in another system, or you need to export it? Jairo, did you want to talk to that, what you've been seeing customers do?
Yeah, so what I've been seeing customers do in this is they'll usually create like a report for their executives. But one thing that's really important here for the dependencies tab that I see more for the use case is when there is a like a 0-day vulnerability, for example, like Log4j. Your CISO might come to you and say, "Hey, do we have this?" I was on my way to work, and on the news I heard that there was this 0-day dependency that was just announced 2 hours ago. Do we have this dependency in any of our projects? This is a really great way to come here and just say, okay, show me all my projects that have this dependency. Now, if it's a net new vulnerability, or it might not show up as critical for now, as our team's still reviewing it, and then we'll update the database. But you would be able to see the dependency there, and you would be able to tie it back to the projects, which then you could take action on.
Now, as far as exporting, we have several different mechanisms, as I mentioned. So you can export to PDF. You can also, we have an API that you can pull that data from. If you're also running scans and CI/CD, again, you have that plugin that can be used to generate artifacts. We also have a webhook, which I believe is in beta, which you can find on our API or apiary site. So there's lots of different ways to get the information for different use cases out of Snyk. Now, just because I know we're a little bit short on time, the last thing that we need to cover is really how do you go about reviewing those issues and actioning on them, and then how do you integrate into Jira, basically, which a very, very similar theme. So again, we'll just go back to that initial environment we were in earlier. So let me go here. I'll do it in my demo environment. So when you're reviewing issues, again, you've seen how you can prioritize, and when you're looking at the actual issues, you've got several different things that you can do with the issues. So let's say we filtered this and we have the 10 issues that, are the worst of the worst that we want to start fixing on. And so what you'll see is that each of the UIs will tell you information, like how was it introduced, or what file was it. There's usually a learn more or a full details button where you can expand and get more info. In this case, we have a link out that describes the vulnerability out to our Snyk Learn website. And then this is where you can actually start doing things with it. So I might ignore it until a fix is available, or I might permanently ignore it and provide a reason why it's ignored. And we can limit this by security permissions, who can do that. We can even create a fix PR. So we can actually say, create a fixed PR and upgrade it to Juicy Chatbot 066. Or we can create a Jira issue, and this will actually communicate with Jira. And actually, in my case, it's picked up all the custom fields. And I'm going to provide the required user. It filled in all the relevant information. We can create the Jira ticket. And what this will do is it'll now create a Jira ticket, and you'll see the number down at the bottom for Jira. And again, we can click on that. It'll take me out to Bitbucket, and you can see, or not Bitbucket, sorry, take me out to Jira, where you can see all the information related to the ticket. So
yeah, when it comes to it, sorry, Shawn. So when it comes to
ahead.
ignores, there is a setting in the main settings tab where you could actually select, hey, who do you want to allow to ignore, right? Do you want the admins? Do you want your developers? So I would recommend taking a look at that. And again, going back to the developer education piece earlier, if you do allow your developers to ignore issues, think through of like what that workflow is going to look like. Right, like, is there someone they have to run it through? Is there, are you going to make it a requirement that they have to add details of why they're ignoring it, things like that?
Yeah, I think common practice is everybody, and I usually cover this in other sessions since this is more of an extension session. This is usually one of the first things I'll tell customers to turn on is require the reason to, you don't want to have that situation where you're trying to remember 6 months later why you ignored something. So at minimum, you'd want to require that. Usually admins are things like the team leads or DevOps or somebody on the security team. Usually you'd limit it to specific users in order to do that. And then you have options around when you can ignore things. So definitely take a look at these settings because that's going to be a core part of your workflow. But as Jairo mentioned, make sure that the exception process is known, like who has the ability to ignore or unignore it. Because again, ignore doesn't mean it disappears. It just means it's filtered. So just keeping in mind that we're at the end of our time, Jairo, I think the most important thing is to set up your integration with Jira is really quick and easy. You go to your Atlassian screen, you pull a token, and basically under integrations, you're just going to provide the URL. So just like you set up GitHub, you find the option for Jira. You're going to provide the URL, a username, and a token from Atlassian. And it literally takes seconds to set up that integration. If you have additional fields, it'll show you here that you can default. If you do have an on-premise Jira, you will need to use something called Broker, and that's available in Business and Enterprise. But that's something where we can cover. You can ask us on Discord, and we'll provide more information. Or you can ask your TSM or Technical Services Manager to help out with that. All right. So we're pretty much at the end of our time now. So I think the most important thing, we're going to open it up to Q&A. But from our standard Q&A that we typically get from customers, if you've just signed up to Snyk and you need an invoice, you can access that from accounts-receivable at Snyk.io, where you can contact support to get that invoice. The other thing is, where do you get those plugins? So remember, the user hub has the link to a lot of our repositories and other things like that. But Jairo, if you're able to drop in the link for SnyktoHTML in chat, that's one of the most common plugins that people use. There's also a secondary plugin called Snyk Filter that's extremely popular from our tech services team. Probably two of the most used plugins at Snyk by customers. So having said that, let's open it up to chat, Q&A. So Jairo, do you have any questions you wanted to flag from the attendees?
No questions today. Looks like we have no questions here. Feel free to also come off mute if there are any questions.
And sorry, I can't see the chat just because I'm in full screen.
Yep, or raise your hand if you have a question and we could unmute you.
Here, let me exit out of the... Okay, I don't see any additional questions. So we are going to be posting the video for attendees and registrants, and definitely feel free to sign up to our Discord. As I said, I'm a moderator, but we have other folks on the team. Whether you want to talk product or talk DevSecOps, we have those options in there. I'd like to thank everybody for your time and wish everybody a good day. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Jairo.
everyone.